Nobody prepares you for the exact moment your life changes. There's no warning, no countdown, no slow transition. 1 second, everything feels normal. Then suddenly it's not. A phone call you didn't expect. A message that feels off. A number on a screen that doesn't look right. Or worse, silence where there used to be noise. And in that moment, something shifts. Not outside. Inside you. Your chest tightens. Your thoughts speed up. Your mind starts racing ahead, trying to figure out what this means, what happens next, how bad this could get. And here's the part most people don't realize. It's not the event that breaks you. It's what your mind does after. Because within seconds, your brain starts building a story, a future, a worst-case scenario, a version of your life where everything falls apart. And before anything has actually happened, you're already overwhelmed. Now, most people respond in one of two ways. They either collapse completely or they pretend they're fine, while quietly falling apart on the inside. Both are human. Both are understandable, but neither actually helps you get through what's coming. There's a third way, and it's not new. It's over 0,000 years old. Discovered by people who had every reason to break and somehow didn't. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how they did it and how you can stay standing even when everything around you starts to fall apart. And if you're going through something right now, this might be the most important video you watch this year. So, subscribe, because what comes next isn't motivation, it's survival. Here's what happens next. And if you've ever gone through something difficult, you'll recognize this immediately. The moment something goes wrong, your mind doesn't stay in the present. It jumps forward, fast. It takes one situation and stretches it across your entire future. You're not just dealing with this problem anymore. You're imagining what it leads to, what it ruins, what it costs you, what it says about your life. And suddenly you're not handling one moment. You're trying to carry the weight of everything that might happen, all at once. That's what breaks people. Not reality, projection. Because your brain is trying to protect you. It thinks, if I can predict everything, I can control it. But it doesn't work like that. Prediction doesn't create control. It creates pressure. And the more you try to mentally solve a future that doesn't exist yet, the more overwhelmed you feel in the present. So you spiral. You replay conversations. You overanalyze details. You imagine outcomes that haven't happened and may never happen. And here's the dangerous part. Your body reacts as if it's all real. Stress feels real. Fear feels real. Anxiety feels real. Even though most of what you're reacting to isn't. It's just a story your mind is telling you. This is why two people can go through the same situation and have completely different experiences. One collapses under the weight of it. The other stays grounded. Not because their life is easier, but because they don't let their mind turn one moment into a lifetime sentence. And that's the shift. The one most people never make. They don't lose to their circumstances. They lose to what they imagine those circumstances mean. So before you try to fix your situation, you have to understand something first. Your mind is not always telling you the truth. And learning to see that is where real control begins. So what do you actually do when the moment hits? When something real happens and it hurts? Here's where most people get Stoicism completely wrong. They think it means shutting down, acting cold, pretending nothing affects you, becoming emotionally numb. That's not strength. That's avoidance. And it doesn't work. Because no matter how hard you try to suppress it, it finds a way out. Later, louder, messier. The Stoics never said, don't feel. They said, feel it, but don't feed it. There's a difference. Feeling is immediate, natural, human. You get the news, your chest tightens, your plans fall apart. You feel it in your gut. Someone walks away, you feel the loss. That part you don't control. But what happens next? You do. Because after the initial reaction, your mind steps in. And it starts adding more meaning, more assumptions, more worst-case scenarios. You replay it. You expand it. You build a narrative around it. And that's where pain turns into suffering. Not in the moment itself, but in everything you layer on top of it. Grief becomes identity. Fear becomes obsession. One bad event becomes a permanent conclusion. Nothing will work out. I'll never recover. This always happens to me. Be honest, that's not the event. That's the story. And the more you repeat that story, the more real it feels, until you're no longer reacting to what happened, you're reacting to what you believe it means. So here's the discipline. Let the emotion move through you without turning it into something bigger than it is. Feel it, but catch the moment you start feeding it. That's where your control begins. And if you can master that, you stop turning temporary pain into permanent suffering. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because once you stop feeding the emotion, you start noticing something else. Your mind isn't just reacting, it's distorting, quietly, automatically, constantly. It takes incomplete information and fills in the gaps, usually with something negative. Someone's tone feels off. They're upset with me. They don't reply right away. They're ignoring me. Something goes wrong. This is going to get worse. Notice the pattern. Your brain doesn't wait for facts. It creates meaning, fast, and most of the time, that meaning isn't accurate. It's protective. Your mind is wired to scan for threats, to assume risk, to prepare for the worst. Thousands of years ago, that kept you alive. Today, it keeps you anxious. Because now, the threat isn't a predator. It's uncertainty. It's silence. It's ambiguity. It's things you don't fully understand yet. So your mind tries to resolve that uncertainty by making something up. A story that feels certain, even if it's wrong. And once that story is in place, everything starts to align with it. You look for proof. You ignore anything that contradicts it. You reinforce it without realizing it. Until eventually, you're living inside a version of reality that your own mind created, not the one that actually exists. This is why people stay stuck. Not because their situation never changes, but because their interpretation never does. So here's the shift. Just because you think something doesn't make it true. Just because it feels real doesn't mean it is. Your mind will offer you a story. You don't have to accept it. And the moment you realize that, you create distance. Distance between you and the noise in your head. And in that distance, you finally get your clarity back. Once you see that your mind can distort reality, the next question becomes simple. What can you actually rely on? What's real? What's stable? This is where Stoicism gives you something most people never build: a clear line. A boundary between what is yours and what never was. Because right now, most of your stress is coming from one mistake. You're trying to control things that don't belong to you. Other people's reactions, their opinions, their timing, their decisions, outcomes, opportunities, how situations unfold. And when those things don't go your way, you feel it immediately. Frustration, anger, helplessness. Not because something is broken, but because you expected control where none exists. So here's the shift the Stoics made. Some things are within your control. Most things are not. What's actually yours? Your actions, your effort, your decisions, your standards, your response. That's it. Everything else, external, unstable. And the more energy you invest in those external things, the less control you feel. Because you're placing your emotional state in the hands of variables you can't manage. But the moment you pull that energy back, everything changes. You stop chasing reactions. You stop obsessing over outcomes. You stop trying to force reality into your expectations. And instead, you focus on execution. What can I do right now? What's the next right action? Who do I choose to be in this moment? Because control was never about dominating your environment. It was about mastering your response to it. And once you lock into that, you don't feel powerless anymore. You feel grounded, even when everything around you isn't. There's one realization that cuts through all the noise faster than anything else. Most people avoid it because it's uncomfortable, but once you truly see it, everything rearranges. You don't have unlimited time. Not in theory. In reality, your days are not guaranteed. Your later is not promised. That version of your life you keep postponing, it's not waiting for you forever. And deep down, you already know that. You've just been living like you don't, because it's easier to assume there's always more time, more chances, more opportunities, more tomorrows to fix things. So you delay. You overthink instead of acting. You hold on to things that don't matter. You stay stuck in patterns you know aren't serving you because you believe you can change later. But later is where most people lose their lives. Quietly. Not in one big moment, but in thousands of small delays. And here's what changes when you really accept that your time is limited. You stop magnifying things that don't deserve it. That argument, it shrinks. That embarrassment, it fades. That need to control everything, it loosens. Because when time becomes real, clarity follows. You start asking better questions. Not, what if everything goes wrong? But what actually matters right now? What deserves my energy today? What kind of person do I want to be while this is happening? Because this moment, the one you're in right now, isn't practice. It's part of your life. And every second you spend trapped in your head is a second you don't get back. That's not meant to scare you. It's meant to wake you up. Because once you stop acting like time is infinite, you stop wasting it on things that were never worth it. At this point, everything comes down to one thing: how you choose to respond. Because the situation, you don't fully control it. Your thoughts, you're learning to question them. Your time, you now understand it's limited. So what's left? Your reaction. And this is where the real separation happens. Because most people react automatically. They follow the first emotion. They act on impulse. They let the moment decide who they are. Pressure hits, they panic. Things go wrong, they spiral. Someone disappoints them, they lose control. Not because they're weak, but because they've never trained another response. But there's a small group of people, call it the 1%, who do something different. They pause. Not for long, just long enough to choose. They feel the same surge of emotion. They notice the same thoughts. They experience the same uncertainty. But instead of reacting immediately, they create space. And in that space, they ask a different question. What does this moment require from me? Not, what do I feel like doing? That's the shift. One is impulse. The other is intention. And that single decision, made over and over again, changes everything. Because your life is not shaped by what happens to you. It's shaped by how you respond when it does. So when the pressure hits next time, and it will remember this, you don't rise to the level of your intentions. You fall to the level of your training. And if you can train yourself to pause, even for a second, you give yourself something most people never have, a choice. And that choice, that's where your strength lives. So after everything we've talked about, this is what it really comes down to. You're not trying to control life. You're building someone who can handle it. Because life doesn't get easier. It doesn't suddenly remove difficulty because you've suffered enough. There will be more moments like the one that brought you here. More uncertainty, more pressure, more things you didn't plan for. That doesn't change, but you can. And that's the point of all of this. When you learn to feel without feeding it, you stop drowning in your emotions. When you stop believing every thought, you stop living in illusions. When you focus only on what you control, you stop wasting energy on things that were never yours. When you respect your time, you stop postponing your life. And when you train your response, you stop being at the mercy of every situation. Put all of that together, and something shifts. You become steady, not because nothing affects you, but because nothing owns you. And that's what the Stoics were really teaching. Not how to avoid pain, but how to stand in the middle of it without collapsing. So the next time life hits, and it will, you won't be asking, why is this happening to me? You'll be asking, who do I choose to be right now? And that question changes everything. Because the goal was never a perfect life. It was a stronger you, one that doesn't break easily, one that doesn't run, one that doesn't get lost inside every storm. If this gave you something real, subscribe. Because this channel isn't about motivation. It's about building a mindset that holds no matter what you're facing. And if you're ready for that next step, watch the next video. It's where this really begins.